Hello, everybody. And hi. So it's good to be here. We're going to be talking about some .NET Core today. And I actually just had a computer crash right before this, so my code demos might be a little slower than as intended. I'd like to start out thanking.
Sorry, did you get that video connected?
Get what? Oh.
Thank you.
Okay, back to video. Video capture on now, and we're going to be talking about .NET Core. I'd like to start out by thanking my employer, Catch Intelligence, who's made it possible for me to be here today and who has been kind enough to let me show a project that I've been working on for them. It's always a little iffy when you're showing something that's proprietary, so they were very kind to let me show it. Catch Intelligence is an SAP Business Objects and Microsoft Certified Partner, and they provide business intelligence services and solutions, advanced analytics, predictive analytics, and data warehousing, and big data strategies. For more information, see catchintelligence.com. All right, so today we're going to discuss and explore .NET Core and technical support website that I've worked on over the summer, some of the design patterns used there. In .NET Core, we're going to cover dependency injection, JSON configuration, unified MVC and web API, and then in the design patterns for the technical support site, we're going to look at presentation logic using Kendo MVVM, bootstrap responsive design, application database context, database seeding, and consistency in end-tier architecture. All right, so the first thing is the Catch technical support site that I was asked to design. The point of it is for our software division. We provide technical support for our software, and so they wanted to be able to have our clients be able to log in, look at the status of their cases, create new cases, add details to a case. Then they also wanted a bit of an administration in the site to be able to administer their users. This connects to Catch's implementation of Microsoft Dynamics CRM, which they use for their customer relationship management. All right, in .NET Core, we now get dependency injection built into the pattern, to the MVC. So with dependency injection, we get a loose coupling between objects. So we don't have to, let's say we don't have to create in our controller, we don't have to instantiate our dependencies. We just call for them to be passed into the controller. And then the MVC templates that you create, like your website templates, they use dependency injection baked in. So when you register a dependency in a startup, I'll show this in just a minute, you can register it at 3 levels, either transient, scoped, or singleton. And singleton creates a new instance every time it's created. Scoped creates a new instance every time per web request. So once a web request starts, the object's requested, and then it stays alive and returns the same object through the whole request lifecycle. And then a singleton, once it's requested, it stays alive while the application stays up. Now, I found what's crashing my computer is having the dual screens, so I'm going to attempt to switch back to single screen to show you. So we'll see how well this works. Yes, all right. So here's the technical support site, the way we designed it. And then in a dependency injection, if I can get to my correct thing here. We have in .NET Core, we've got, yes, let me get up the right one here. All right, so in .NET Core, you probably can't see the Solution Explorer over here too well, but in the main folder of our web application, we have startup.cs, and that's where we initialize our dependency in the configure services method. And you can see here that we have several services, and this one is one that was, this is our email sender. This is one that was created in the, with the MVC template when I created my new project. And then I just added some code to send an email. And so now if I leave this during my presentation, I'm going to get errors because the SMTP server I'm trying to connect to lives at Catch Intelligence, and I don't have a connection to that here. So during my presentation, I would get errors. However, before all of this, I created, get to it real quick. I created another implementation, and this one, all it does is sends a task notification that it finished. So it doesn't actually send the email, it just, right here, it just says, yes, everything's good. So with dependency injection, all I have to do to change to that is, not do that. Let's try that again. Change to my not sending auth message sender. And now anywhere that would request an iEmail sender is going to get my sender that won't send the email and won't cause message or errors. So that's one of the powerful things in dependency injection. Instead of having to go through my whole project looking for anywhere that I instance that, I can just change it here in the startup, and now all of a sudden I'm using a different service, and my whole application will continue to run. So let me go ahead and find a place that's consuming that. Yeah.
The services there, what is that object? What type of object is that?
It's an iServices collection, and it's actually built as part of this class. And the website MVC template is, as you start a new project, it creates this all for you. And you can actually implement iServices on your own and whatnot. I just let .NET do it for me. This was actually my first .NET Core application. At Catch, we decided to implement it on this project just to get more familiar with .NET Core so that we could be up to speed when a customer asked for it or whatnot. All right, so I was going to find an implementation. Of that. Okay. So that's actually in the model. That won't work. All right. So this is one of my controllers. And in .NET Core, we actually request the resources we need in the, what do you call this? The constructor, yeah, that's right. And so you can see I'm requesting a user manager. I'm requesting server authentication configuration object, and here's our iEmail sender. So it knows from startup when somebody asks for when a controller asks for an iEmail sender, it's going to send this implementation. So that's the basics of dependency injection. And I've not studied it a ton, but it's been pretty useful for this project, not having to instantiate an email sender in the constructors. All right. Now, let's see. If I can get this back to a dual screen. And get my slideshow back up. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. Oh, this is what we're looking for right here. Now the remote's not working. There we go. All right, so JSON configuration is another new thing in .NET Core. So they've changed the old proj XML to JSON. Web config has become JSON as well instead of XML. It's pretty interesting. We can quickly create complex and strongly typed objects in our configurations, and using a dependency injection, we can pass them along. So let me see if I can get back to there and show that off. Kind of a apologize for the slow switching. Okay, so configuration. So our web config becomes appsettings.json. And as you can see, it's a JSON file. And so I've actually added a lot of these. Logging was default, connection strings was default, application insights was default. This default application data I created, pretty much everything else I created. And so if we look for like server application data, and I go to where it's set up in startup, you can see in my services object, I'm adding a configure, and the type I'm adding is a object I created in my models. I created a configuration section in my models, and if we go to this definition, you can see that I've just got pretty much the structure I set up in the JSON file. So a list of admin accounts, list of user accounts, and the account password. So I just created a class that represents what I created in the JSON file, and then I tell it here to get the configuration.get section, and it deserializes the JSON and puts it in as a default application data object. So that's pretty easy and, in my opinion, a fun way to get your settings. I I can remember with the old web config style, you had to register a new config section and whatnot. It was a little more messy. All right, so that looks good, so I'm not going to mess with it. Unified MVC and Web API. In our, before .NET Core, our MVC and Web API, we had to have a separate configuration to set up like the routes for Web API versus the routes for MVC. And we also had to have different controller based on whether we're doing Web API or MVC. And now both technologies are merged into one controller, and the controllers automatically return JSON responses, which our presentation layer can more easily consume. So if I look at one of my controllers, let's just go ahead and look at the admin controller here. You can see that I'm only inheriting from controller. And then this is my constructor. So now I can either return an action result, which will return a view, which we're used to in MVC, or you can see here, I'm not returning a view. I'm returning a task and a list of entities that I get from my model. So in this case, this list of contacts will be JSON. So it just drops it in JSON. So I'm not doing any sort of JSON serialization or converting it to a JSON object. I'm just returning it. And then .NET Core does all the magic in the back end and returns it to JSON for my web API that requests it. So that's, in my opinion, that's a lot easier now and makes us .NET guys look awesome when we're just spitting out the web API, right? And all we're really doing is just returning a list of something. All right. So switching over to some of the design patterns used in the technical support site. Oh, I changed over too fast. I apologize. So on our presentation side, we decided to use Kendo MVVM for our JavaScript interfacing. It allows us to separate our JavaScript from our presentation layer. It gives us a observable data model. So something changes in the data, changes on the screen. Very similar to Angular 1. We wanted to use Angular 2, but at the time it was in release candidate, so my boss said no until it's out. So instead we used the MVVM. Kendo is a JavaScript toolkit that has controls such as grid, window, form controls. And so if we look at the website, so this is a support case. This is a Kendo grid here. And this would be a Kendo window. So it's providing that functionality so we don't have to write it from the ground up. And then if we look at how it's created, so we'll first go to our model. And I believe I was on the cases. So if we go to model, and I believe it's the support model and the cases. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not models, it's views. So this is the page that we were just on. And so Kendo MVVM is a decorator pattern. So In this case, like my grid, I can assign data role, and then I can decorate it with the configuration that I want, just using attributes. So this describes the grid that I want to create. And then in my data bind here, you can see that my source is cases, and it binds events and whatnot. What you don't see in here is much JavaScript. We have a little bit of like JSON in our decorators. So I've actually registered my JavaScript down here. It also has template. I can do like templates as well. But I've registered my JavaScript, and then I'll come up to my JavaScript. And I want to go to cases. So in my Kendo, in my JavaScript, I create an observable object. And then you can see one of my properties is cases, and that's a data source. And that will actually read to my MVC API and get the data. So when you see this, the page spins a little bit. That's when it loads the page, talks to the web API, grabs a list of data, and then displays it as a grid. To kick all that off, we use kendo.bind and just a jQuery, just bind it to the view. I'm calling it a view. Let's see. I've got too many windows open. Close them. But really it's just a grid, a div. So this observable allows me to have a JavaScript object that when something in here changes, my HTML will change. So now if we go to a page that's a little more complex, this is our case details. And I've actually broken this up into several different views. So we've got a notes section, case details. And you can see that I have my HTML partial async, and I load case info and case notes. And then I have my HTML for case info, and the JavaScript then kicks in and decorates it out with the Kendo. And so what we're getting out of that is a separation of concerns where the HTML handles the HTML and the JavaScript is separated from it. I like that just for a little bit better organization. Okay, so when you create a new project, even today in the current .NET, it's going to create with Bootstrap. What that gives us is responsive design. I'm sure you're all quite familiar with that. I found that in the consulting space, we have more and more clients asking to make sure that whatever we're creating for them at the time is responsive. So .NET has already given us a lot of those tools out of the box. The project it creates is already set up referencing Bootstrap. And what that gives us is a way to be able to make our sites so that they change as with the screen size. Let me see if I can make this a little taller. All right, so you see you have the two sections next to each other, and the menu up top, as our screen size gets smaller, now all of a sudden the section stack gets a little smaller and the menu collapses. That way it still looks fine on the phones, but we haven't done any new code, which is nice. So Bootstrap's pretty easy. I think most of you probably know it, but it involves using these columns. So this one's 12. So it breaks the screen up into 12 columns, and then you do your classes to decide how much of those 12 columns you're going to take up. And then it automatically will stack on top of each other if it needs to based on the screen size. Pretty easy and fun. And I'll sit here and just do this over and over again, watching my site change just because it's fun to watch. The Kendo UI for responsive design, Kendo does not integrate with Bootstrap, so I had to do a little more work on, say, like this page, where you see it has like the description here, and as our screen gets smaller, the description will disappear. Then as it gets smaller, columns start disappearing, just so it still looks good on the screen. I had to actually do JavaScript for that because I could have done like some fancy CSS to do it as well, but I chose JavaScript just because Kendo's more of a JavaScript library, so it's a little easier. In interest of time, unless anybody's real interested, I'll skip showing you how I did it. All right. The template comes with a built-in application database context if you select to do a user repository when you're creating your website. For my project, for this technical support project, we had a requirement to provide a user store, which the template created for us out of the box, which was nice and easy. We also had a requirement to provide logging. As a user did an action like creating a case, we wanted to be able to know that they created the case by looking at a log in the database. So to meet that requirement was pretty easy using just what the MVC had created out of the box. They use Entity Framework to create their stuff and Code First. So this was created by the template, by the MVC.NET Core template. And it's an application DB context that inherits from identity DB context. And identity defines all of the entities for the user store. Instead of creating myself a whole entire new DB context, I added this little thing right here, which my models design a user activity class. And I make that a DB set as a property of this application context. And then in Code First, when I initialize the database, it will actually initialize a user activity table. And then if I go to the definition, it also initializes my identifier and all of my fields for me, which I thank Code First for that, because then I don't have to get into the database and do any of that database work. We can even decorate it with things like max length, and there's a whole lot more, but I kept it pretty simple since it was a simple requirement. So I have run into this scenario quite often where I'll create my application and then I'll try to move it over to like QA or to prod, and all of a sudden my application no longer has any users in it and nobody can log in, no admins are created, and then it becomes a whole big mess of getting into the database and hurriedly creating users, trying to reverse engineer how they create users. It's just ugly. This time around, I decided to do it right and do a seeding where when the application starts up, it makes sure that the database has a base amount of users and whatnot in it to be functional. I think I have a slide for that. Yes, yay, database seeding. So if we look at my JSON, I actually have this is app settings.json. I have created this section where we have a list of admins accounts the database should seed, a list of normal accounts, and the password they're going to use. So if you copy that, you'll only be able to hack my dev machine. I wanted to make it pretty clear that that's not what we're using in production. But the cool thing about this is when I go over to a production machine, I can change the app settings.json to have whatever the requirements require. This person and this person should be admins. We want a couple of test accounts. I just put it in the JSON, and then when the application fires up, it makes sure those are there. And then it's pretty let's see. Let's go to startup, which I don't have open at this time. Oh, this right hand side thing is driving me nuts. So anyway, startup. And I already showed you this once, but this is our default application data configuration. So the iServices stack is aware of the configuration object. I also registered my seed class that I created. So that's registered as a transient. So at any time something calls it, which coincidentally configure is a method that can accept the dependencies. So you can see I called for an application DB context seed, and it will give it to me as an object. And then in my configure, I call this seed user roles and data. So this happens on application start. And then in here, I call the database migrate. So it's going to make sure that all the tables are created and are up to date. And then I create my roles as is configured. Now, one thing that we don't see is the configuration here. So I'm not passing the configuration from this area. But if you look at the constructor, I requested the configuration. So I have those settings because of dependency injection. Then I can go through and create my users. All right, so N tier. It's been around for a long, long time, and we still use it. So one of the requirements was to connect to Microsoft Dynamics CRM. That's where you see the case information comes out of Dynamics CRM. If they add a case, if they add a note in a case or an attachment or a file or any of that, it's added to CRM. That way our technical support people can get into CRM where they're comfortable and view the details of their cases and communicate with our customers through the website, but they don't have to get into the website or the website's admin administration or anything. They can just do it from CRM. instead of putting all my code into just directly into the models, I created a new class project, and I handle all of the communications with CRM in that class project. That way, if they come to me tomorrow and say, we'd really like you to create a Windows application that does this, then I don't have to go copy and paste all my stuff from the web application to the Windows application. And then of course, an end tier, we have an entity layer that creates entities that everybody knows about. So my engine returns entities that are defined in the entity layer, and then I have a process layer that the web layer will talk to that decides what engine to get what data from. So that's kind of basic on end tier. It allows us to develop something once, and then if we have another project that needs it, we can just go grab it and take it. So anything in our web project should be dealing with web presentation and getting data from the process layer and giving data back to the process layer. But it shouldn't be so concerned about where the data is going. Process layer figures that out. So I didn't say all my talking points here, but a few of the things we get out of it is loose coupling, separation of concerns, and reusable services. So that concludes what I've prepared. Is there any questions?
As far as the services go, how you wire those out, is there a way to do that via configuration or some kind of more automated way?
You mean, is there a way to configure which service is going to load based on some sort of a configuration? Off the top of my head, you could have more of a service-oriented way of actually, so let's say we want to have an email sender, but we don't want the web layer to care which email sender it gets. You could provide like a process, like a factory pattern in the process where the process object meets the interface, but it actually passes on the work to whichever service it chooses. You could put conditionals in your, let me get back to my startup. You could put conditionals here in the configure services. When I was reading up on it, I did see they had some pretty fancy techniques. I'm not thinking of all of them off the top of my head, so you'll probably have to do some research on that. But I know they do have some pretty fancy ways to do that.
If it's consistent with the way that OWEN is built, I would expect like the ad identity and ad key context and ad application or sites, whatever. All those would probably be extension methods.
Yeah.
Maybe even an assembly. Could you just hover over one of those or go to that? Yeah. Okay, so we have it just accepted by service supply.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so you can follow that same pattern. And they actually provided like links all over the place in their generated code. Go look here and figure things out and whatnot, so it was pretty handy. I didn't create a slide for it, and I meant to, but few of the things I ran into in .NET Core. It does not like talking to old assemblies, so like old DLLs from .NET 4, 4.5, or anything you created before. It's going to get really grumpy about consuming, including like the Microsoft Dynamics CRM SDK. So for me to talk to Dynamics CRM, I actually ended up using their REST SDK. So I was doing REST calls back and forth because they don't have a .NET Core SDK. So things like that are going to, when you start a project, make sure that your dependencies are created in in .NET Core, or be prepared to write it yourself.
Have you run into any issues with .NET Core Entity Framework?
The question was, have I run into issues with the .NET Core Entity Framework? I had a very small requirement on that, which was one table plus the user store, and that worked perfectly. So I did not. It was actually very smooth and very nice. I think I might have had a little bit of confusion in just the console where you have to initialize your database and whatnot, but it wasn't bad at all. It worked very well. This site is actually in user acceptance testing right now, so we don't even have it out to our client base. So I would have to tell you after it goes out into the wild how well it handles a heavier load than our 2 QA people and my boss and whatnot. Yes?
I know one of the big things with Core is cross-platform compatibility. Have you deployed this to any Unix-based servers?
I have not deployed it to Unix-based servers, but it would be just as easy to deploy to Unix-based servers as it is to IIS. I actually had to install an extension for IIS to get this to run in IIS. And if you look at, I don't think I have it set up on my dev VM, but if you look at it, you're used to seeing where it's running an application pool. That's actually turned off for .NET Core. And it actually uses the executables inside the folder to run the web application. So it's kind of a different way of thinking about running web apps. So I feel like it would have been just as easy to deploy on Linux as it ended up being in Windows. Right, right. You can run it in Docker. Right. So my work is pretty much a Microsoft shop, so the requirement was to run it through IIS, so I didn't work on running it through Linux or anything. But the website itself, since I really didn't consume anything besides REST services, should be able to run on anything.
So is this running on the same server as any framework sites? Do they play well together? Can a server run both like a Core 5 and a Core, or does it have to be one or the other? Were there any special tweaks you had to do to IIS that was broken? Any framework stuff?
I did have to install an add-on for IIS, but I currently have it running on a web server that is running your classic .NET web applications, and we have not noticed any conflicts at this time.
In terms of tooling, what does it take to get started?
Define tooling.
Like Visual Studio?
Visual Studio requires an add-on. You go to, I typed in .NET Core, and they said, get this, and get this, and get this. And so I downloaded them, installed them, and off I went.
Yes, 2015.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Actually, could use that web-based Visual Studio based on that.
Right.
Yeah, just
You can. I like the full 2015. I'm still stuck on that. So any other questions? Well, thank you, everybody. You've been a very quiet and attentive audience. I appreciate it.